Okay. Hello, people of the internet. Welcome to the Monarch Science blog. It's me, Andy Davis. I'm the author of the blog, and I'm coming to you today from my home because I'm working from home today. Hopefully my computer will be able to handle this. I'm going to have a conversation today with a student who has recently completed an impressive publication on the Cape May monarch migration monitoring data. So I'm here talking with Kat Culbertson, who is the lead author of this brand new study. And the study was published in the journal Global Change Biology. It just came out this past month, and I've read through it. I'm really excited to talk to Kat about it because it's a fascinating study. It's a data set that I know pretty well. I've worked with it before, and I know a lot of the authors as well. So I'm really happy to be talking with Kat today about this project. So welcome, Kat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So maybe you could tell my viewers, about yourself, where you are now, and how you came into this whole project.
Yeah, of course. So right now I'm a first-year PhD student at UC Berkeley in environmental science management and policy. And I've always been a monarch enthusiast, shall we say. I got started back when I was 7 or 8 years old, raising monarch caterpillars, which really introduced me to some of the marvels of the natural world and inspired me to become an ecologist. While I was looking for some work last summer due to some changes in plans from the pandemic, I ended up working at New Jersey Audubon Society for a couple of months as their seasonal monarch naturalist. And so the New Jersey Audubon Society has a project monitoring monarchs' fall migration going through Cape May, New Jersey for the past 30 years. This is a really interesting place to be looking at the fall migration for monarchs because you see these large accumulations of monarchs as they pass through the peninsula. As they're traveling down through New England, you can imagine, because the east coast of the United States kind of juts out towards the east. As the monarchs are traveling south, they run into the coast and then follow the coast down to Cape May before they cross the Delaware Bay over into Delaware. And so it actually provides a high enough concentration of monarchs to pretty consistently be able to count them day to day throughout the fall migration. And then we can look at patterns both within migration seasons and trends over time and abundance and timing of that fall migration.
Awesome. So they hired you, and you took one look at the data and said, why isn't this published yet?
More or less, yeah. I mean, it's very rare to have such a long-term data set. Almost 30 years is 29 years worth of data that went into this paper. That's been so consistently collected every day during the monarchs migration season through Cape May. Monarch naturalist interns that are hired every year are going out there and counting the butterflies along a set transect, so a very specific route. And we go out there 3 times a day during the beginning of the season and 2 times a day towards the end when the days are a little bit shorter because monarchs clearly aren't active during the night. And we count those. So we have a really great representation of how many monarchs are passing through over time.
Yeah, the consistency of that data set is just phenomenal. And the fact that they've been doing it the same way for almost 30 years now. And it goes back to Lincoln Brower's days. Lincoln and Dick Walton were the ones who started this back in the early 90s. And, thanks to Dick for keeping it going. And then now Mark Garland took the reins for a while. And, those people have been really deserve a lot of credit in keeping this project going, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I unfortunately was never able to meet Dr. Brower himself, but he and Dick put a lot of thought into designing this study, and into making sure that it was something that would occur for the long term. And even before they really realized what the patterns might be over time, and the discussion of climate change, I don't believe was really a part of any initial conversations, but just having this long-term data set provides a lot of opportunities that you can kind of look back on when you see conditions change, and then say, well, how might these populations change, or how might these trends in migration change due to these factors that we didn't even anticipate potentially at the beginning of the study. And another thing I want to note too is that both Dick and Mark are not PhD scientists by training. They're educators. They're people that are really engaged in outreach, which is so important for the long-term survival and conservation of monarch butterflies and all of our natural environment, really. But their dedication to this science, even though they aren't primarily researchers themselves, is incredibly impressive.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. Kudos to them. Mark and I go back many years too. And, it's, I've always been impressed, I think, by this long-term project. But you made a nice segue into this whole new project here when you talked about the changing environment, because I think that's what you were after with this paper. Do you want to pull up a screenshot of it and show folks like the actual paper itself?
For sure. Here,
I don't think it's actually publicly available online on the journal. So this might be a good thing to show folks.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not. I think for those who aren't very familiar with the peer-reviewed literature, unfortunately, it costs quite a bit of money to make publications open access. So unfortunately, availability of these papers to the general public kind of hinges on how much money is available for studies. But work like this, blogs and other science communication is really vital in getting out this word. So here's the top of the paper itself. And yeah, and we can look at some figures too, or whatnot.
Yeah, so I think the gist of this project, correct me if I'm wrong, this stemmed from some anecdotal observations that folks like Mark and Dick had been making over the years, that they were thinking like, hey, the monarchs are coming later and later. And then that's sort of where you come in to try to test this idea with the actual data?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, it's really interesting when you have people that have been working in an area as like real old school naturalists who are really out there and looking at the environment and reading the changes of the seasons and the populations or abundances in various populations over the migration season. I mean, there's a lot of people that are in Cape May that are watching birds as well as monarch butterflies. And they can see anecdotally various changes throughout the years in terms of timing, in terms of abundance, in weather factors, and how weather factors might or might not correlate with timing of migration. But of course, anecdotal evidence is not something we can like really lean into when we're thinking about science and then policy implications of monarch conservation. So by looking at this robust data set, we were really able to evaluate those anecdotal stories and see that yes, monarch butterflies are traveling through Cape May later in the season than they have in the past.
All right, so let's another good segue. Let's just jump to the, just briefly go over some of the procedures that you did here. If you want to just scroll to like one of your figures. As I understand it, you have all this data on the numbers of monarchs coming through week by week, and essentially what you did was you looked at the dates of when the monarchs were coming through en masse, and you look to see if those average dates are shifting backwards because of, presumably climate change.
Right. Yeah. So I think actually this figure might be the best introduction into this. You can see we looked at the average percent abundance on each day of the year, and the reason that we are looking at percentage rather than actual numbers is because there is a lot of variation year to year in monarch populations. There are some years where we'll see hundreds of monarchs on like multiple days, and some years where that really just doesn't happen. So by controlling it for the number of monarchs coming through, we can kind of see how those trends vary like between years. And so we can see it that in the first decade of the study, from 1992 to 2000, the average percent abundance coming through in the early part of the migration season and the middle of the migration season is later than in the subsequent decades of the study here. But the most notable difference that we see really is in this latest portion of the migration period. So this is just dividing September and October into 3 equal periods. So the latest portion there is going to be after October 11th, from October 11th to October 31st. And you can see that in the first decade of the study, there were very few monarchs percentage-wise coming through during that late part of the season. And yet in the third decade of the study, this most recent decade, there are far more monarchs coming through later in the season. And these confidence intervals here don't overlap, which is more, scientific jargon perhaps, but it just really shows that there is a very distinct difference in the number or the percentage of monarchs that are traveling through at the end of the season.
I think it's a really great figure to show. And if I could just sum it up, it basically shows that there's more monarchs coming through later in the fall now than there used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so why is that? I mean, I know why it's important, but maybe tell the audience why that's important.
Yeah, so the reason, there's many different reasons why this could be particularly important, but fundamentally, when you think about migration, you have animals traveling across vast landscapes. And why are they traveling? They're traveling because they're following an abundance of resources and favorable conditions for them, right? So they're going to where their food is available and where the climate will actually allow for their survival and for them to thrive, right? And so when you think about butterflies in particular, they are feeding off of nectar. That's their only food source. And so they depend on flowering plants to fuel their journey. They're traveling many miles every day as they're going from northern New England and Canada, in some cases, all the way down to central Mexico. And as they're refueling, they are also trying to build up fat reserves to take even more nectar, which will allow them to survive the winter when they're not as active. But the thing about flowering plants is many times they're basing their flowering off of a certain time of year based on maybe the length of the day. And so that's not something that changes over time, even with climate change. If the climate's getting warmer, the lengths of the days aren't changing, so the flowering is still probably going to be occurring at the same time. And this has been noted in various systems. But if the monarchs are arriving later, then that means that they're probably not going to have as much access to nectar, which of course is going to make their journey more difficult, and they may not be able to get the food that they need to make it to Mexico, and once they make it to their overwintering colonies, to actually have enough fat reserves to make it through the winter.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, especially towards with this, the migration and the survival during winter. I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, later migrations, for whatever the reason, are never a good thing. It means you arrive late to your destination, which is not good, or you just don't arrive because you've missed the window of opportunity. And in New Jersey, especially, there is a window where later in the fall, it starts to get pretty cold and stormy, and monarchs can encounter lots of obstacles like that that would keep them from being successful. So later migration means low migration success, right?
Yeah, and that's what a few studies that have tried to at least look at proxies for migration success have kind of demonstrated that you don't see monarchs that have been tagged being recovered in Mexico if they were tagged later in the season.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not a perfect representation of whether or not the butterflies survive in Mexico, and we can't track them exactly, but it indicates that if they arrive later, or if they leave later, then they might just not arrive.
And I did see that you also incorporated some of the tagging data from Cape May too, because that's also that was really, really great that you were able to do that, because I think they've been sitting on those data for a while, and it's about time we saw them. So it looked to me like there was 100,000 tags, something like that, or 200,000, something crazy.
Yeah, let me see if I have the exact number up here. I know I have a table that just shows some of the percent recovered here. So yeah, of monarchs that were tagged over the this isn't quite the entire 29-year period. We only went up through 2017 because sometimes it takes a couple of years for tags to be properly recorded and processed when monarchs are found in Mexico.
Yeah.
But through 1992 to 2017, nearly 90,000 monarchs were tagged in Cape May. And yeah, only 90 of those were actually found in Mexico. So of course, that's a really tiny percentage to start with. But then we see that that percentage is even smaller if we're looking at that last third of the migration season. There are only 4 butterflies tagged after October 11th in Cape May were ever recorded in Mexico. And that's very notable and falls in line with larger scale migration studies like Monarch Watch, the organization that really distributes the tags and keeps track of the monarchs that are recovered, recently has done some larger studies looking at broader swaths of area where monarchs are tagged and have demonstrated some similar trends.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent use of these tagging data. But the other thing that jumps out at me is the low overall recovery rate from this area. I mean, this is something that's been known for a while, but your recovery rates, or the rates from Cape May, are notably lower than what you would see in the Midwest, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to say off the top of my head that it's something like 10 times lower.
Yeah.
Which is very significant. Yeah. And so, I mean, the sort of hypothesis for that, I guess it hasn't necessarily been empirically proven, really demonstrated in practice, but that when monarchs are migrating along the coast, they are facing a lot more natural obstacles than they might be flying through the Midwest. So if they get swept out to sea, especially at one of these big crossings like you have from Cape May over into Delaware, then that's going to sharply decrease the number of monarchs who can make it out there. And really, people started tagging in these great numbers in Cape May because there was some skepticism about whether monarchs from Cape May or monarchs traveling along the eastern seaboard at all could actually make it to Mexico, because it just seemed that much more difficult for them to make the journey. But clearly from these data, we've shown that there are monarchs from Cape May that make it to Mexico. Maybe it is a bit more difficult for them, but they can still do it, which is really impressive.
Well, you're referring to the sort of some of the older literature that describes a bit of a debate that was going on between Lincoln and Dr. Fred Urquhart, actually. Back in the 70s, there was a number of papers where those two were sort of arguing back and forth as to whether the monarchs that are found on the Atlantic flyway, whether they're an aberrant migration pattern, or if they are they were wondering whether these are monarchs that have sort of lost their way, or where are they monarchs that are sort of choosing to go that way? And I don't know if the debate has ever been resolved, even with this data, because you can clearly show that, yes, monarchs from Cape May arrive at the overwintering sites with these data, but there are also recoveries of Cape May monarchs in Florida.
Mhm.
A lot of them actually, and probably more than this. And so, you know, the answer, the question about where these monarchs are trying to get to is still kind of unresolved, which it's not a bad thing. It's just sort of one of the other, interesting facets of the monarch migration that we still have yet to work out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great point. And to my knowledge, like nobody really knows what's going on with monarchs going to Florida and how they might interact with local populations of monarchs there that don't migrate and overwinter in the same way that most of the Eastern population does. So, yeah, is it just chance that leads them to Florida or to Mexico? Are they following some sort of cue to a specific destination? And I mean, to my knowledge, I'm not sure
Yeah.
anyone really knows that for sure.
One of my pet theories these days is that, at some point we may discover that there are subpopulations of monarchs all around the country that each have their own unique destination that they're trying to get to. The reason I say that is because we're finding this out now with birds, because of the technology we have to track bird migrations. And it's not there yet with monarchs, but we can put a tracker on a bird and follow it around the world. And we're finding now that if you put trackers on two birds from the same mountain range,
Mhm.
they'll each go to a different wintering destination, but then they'll come back to breed at the same mountain range, or vice versa. And so it turns out that the migrations of birds are much more complex than we thought. And I wonder if something like this is going on in the monarch world. It's just my pet theory, but 20 or 200 years from now, maybe I'll be proven right. But
Well, I mean, hopefully we'll know a little bit sooner than that. I mean, from what I understand, it seems like they are starting to be able to track monarchs over shorter distances, but
yeah.
really haven't created anything that a monarch can really fly with all the way to Mexico yet. Um, and yeah, that would really
Yeah.
revolutionize this branch of ecology.
So I see above your table here, there's a really interesting graph that maybe we could talk about before we finish up here. So this was the other component to your study. I mean, one of the original long-term goals with this project was to determine whether or not the monarchs in Cape May, are experiencing any kind of declines or any kind of population swings, which is sort of what you were tackling here.
Um, yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, we do have the data for abundance between years also, and it is really important to look at that in conjunction with timing data, because yeah, if we see that there's a drop in population over time, then that might have like other implications for what might be driving these changes in migration timing. But we didn't really see any trend in abundance over time, which was really interesting, right? Because we know that monarch colonies that we're aware of in Mexico are losing or becoming smaller over time, and especially in this time period between like 2012 to forgetting the exact amount, or like more or less 2005, I'm sorry, to 2015, there, we saw a very sharp decrease in Mexico, which unfortunately I don't have a graph here to compare that to, but we don't really see that in this population. And of course, there's many reasons why that might be, and various populations of monarchs seem to be more or less correlated with those trends of population in Mexico, going back to your point earlier, Andy, about there being potentially many subpopulations that have like very different migration and also like population dynamics. So it's also points to a very interesting unresolved issue, I would say.
So let me put you on the spot here. So are the monarchs in trouble in Cape May?
I think that's a tough question. I don't know that we can really say that monarchs are or aren't in trouble in like smaller geographic locations, just because the population as a whole is like going to interact with and in some way with smaller locations as well, right? So maybe there's a certain point at which the overall population drops to that we would see some impacts in Cape May, but we don't really know what thresholds that might be. Or if the population is pretty distinct in Cape May, then maybe they are less at risk than monarchs in the Midwest. But because we don't really know how subpopulations of monarchs may or may not interact, I'm not sure we can really answer that question right now. Something that people in Cape May have been talking about, and I'm sure you're well aware of this as well, is just the differences in land use change in the Northeast versus the Midwest right now. So as I mentioned earlier, the source area for the monarch population that's migrating through Cape May is, well, everything north and east of Cape May, right? So we're looking at New England and like southern Canada in there, and those areas aren't as like heavily agricultural as much of the Midwest, where a good majority of the monarch population that we find in Mexico seems to be coming from. And so because there might not be as much land use change, not as much herbicide application that might kill off the monarch caterpillar's food source, the milkweed, we might not see as much of a downward trend in population in the Northeast.
All right. Well, let me further put you on the spot then. So
yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
If your data is representative of monarchs coming from the Northeast, which you said, and if the numbers of monarchs in Cape May has not gone down from over the last 30 years, doesn't this imply that the population in the Northeast is doing well?
It might not. I think that's a good question. It's a very much an open question now, right? So when we think about monarch migration, it's not like the same monarchs are making the whole journey and living through multiple years, right? As birds would when you're looking at bird migration. So if monarchs in the Northeast are mostly going to Mexico, and more of them are potentially not surviving their journey there, which is leading to like lower numbers of monarchs in Mexico. Then what happens on the return journey? Are they able to increase their population over the summer to a level where it doesn't really matter what the overwintering population was? And then in that sense, you would say, well, maybe the monarchs in the Northeast are fine because given like a widespread abundance of food for caterpillars, the populations are able to recover even from declining overwintering numbers. Or is there a point at which the overwintering numbers are so low, or the migration, especially from the Northeast to Mexico, would be so arduous that there's just not enough getting there, and then those monarchs aren't returning? Then would you see ultimately a sort of crash in the population? And I don't know that that's something that we can really understand fully at this point.
I think you're tiptoeing.
This is, I mean, it's hard because we don't know what the dynamics are between potential subpopulations, as you mentioned before, right? I can't say anything conclusively.
You have the longest running monarch population data set that we have. Almost the longest run in this country. And if you're saying that you cannot tell whether the monarchs are in trouble from this one data set, I find that unsatisfying, I guess. You know, if ever there was a data set where we should be able to draw some conclusions, it's this one.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and it just points to the complexity of the monarch life cycle, and yeah, and their just use of resources over an enormous space. If I was looking at a population that I knew wasn't like if we, in a hypothetical case where monarchs, say from the Northeast, are actually traveling to Florida, and that population is completely disconnected from Mexico, then I would say, well, maybe this population is totally fine, but the Midwestern one is in jeopardy. Or if the monarchs I knew were staying in the Cape May area year round, then I would say, yeah, this population is definitely fine. But because we aren't really able to very clearly connect these linkages between populations and across the journey of monarchs, we're left with a very unsatisfying answer. I agree with you on that. It is very unsatisfying.
All right. Well, we can leave it at that. I mean, yeah, it's a complex issue, and there's lots of opinions on this matter as well, and there's lots of you know, momentum, you know, in conserving monarchs, and you know, a lot of people want to help out. Speaking of that, you know, people probably come to Cape May and they come to your talks, you know, and they say, what can we do to help? What is it that you tell people?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is to just plant native plants in your yard and advocate for the planting of native plants that will be flowering, especially during monarchs migration season through your area, and also throughout the summer, and to plant milkweeds for the caterpillars to feed on too. Because I mean, going back to what I said earlier about land use change, if we are getting rid of all of the food sources for monarchs throughout large areas, then the population is just going to crash. And I think the best thing that people can do on an individual basis is really to ensure that that habitat is available for them, and to maybe work with your community and other interested individuals in creating networks of habitat, because one island of milkweed in suburbia might not help monarchs if they aren't able to get to it, but a bunch of little islands that allow the monarchs to kind of hop frog through on their journey is really invaluable.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. You know, I'm gonna let you go, because I think you've done a great job explaining this project to us, to me. I want to congratulate you again on getting this published, and in such a fine journal. I kind of complained to Mark once that, you know, this is the paper I would have written if it were me, and I would have published it in exactly the same journal, because I think the story is a global change story, right? It's the monarchs are showing us that something is changing in their migration, and you know, this is a great use of these data. So congrats again on getting this published, and to all the other authors, you know, so great job on that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. We're very excited to have it out there, and see the fruit of all the work that's been going on in Cape May for the past 30 years.
Yes. So I'm going to stop recording, and then I'll post this to my blog. And thank you, folks, for watching. And yeah, tune in next time.